all for coming. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your weekly update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today we'll talk about homelessness in the San Francisco Bay Area with guests. John Eckstrom, CEO of Shelter Incorporated, Beth Stokes, Executive Director of Episcopal Community Services, and Shari, Wooldridge, Executive Director of St. Vincent de Paul Society. And a reminder to Zoom attendees, we will take 3 snap polls during the show and we'll announce results. And questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you all for joining us. I'm so excited about talking about this really important topic because across the United States, homelessness is such a big issue, and particularly in our urban centers. The San Francisco Bay Area is one of the wealthiest places in the world, yet we have this incredible homelessness issue. So John Eckstrom, could you talk about how you see this issue first, and then we'll delve into the programs that each of you offer. But if we can just sort of go around the table, we'll start with you, John, we'll go to Beth, and then Shari. Just talk about how you see this overarching issue in the United States and in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate being here. I think it's a more complex issue than most people perceive. Homelessness has been with us, for decades, literally. We've noticed it a lot in California in the last 20 or 30 years. I think a lot of that has to do with our mental health system, where we really didn't compensate once a lot of the mental health facilities, state facilities were shut down. Many of them were rightfully shut down. They weren't great places. But we never came back with a comprehensive way of dealing with mental health issues. I think the other piece too is after redevelopment went away, the state currently has almost a need for 4 million new housing units. So we're caught in this catch-22. So while there's the chronic homeless folks that have been out there for a long time, a lot of them is what we see on the streets, but there are families and individuals that have been severely impacted by the rise in rental costs, and now, of course, with COVID.
And Beth, how do you see the problem? Is it that same constellation that John laid out in terms of our failure to deal with the shuttering of mental health facilities, and then the issue of unaffordability, or are there other factors that you see, Beth?
Yeah, I think there's a multitude of factors. I think to dovetail onto what John said, it is a complex issue. Yet I think that for each individual who is experiencing homelessness and unhoused, their story is unique. Everyone has kind of a unique experience in their lives to get to that place. Yet what's not unique with everyone who's unhoused is that they don't have housing. What they don't have is a home. And I think that to get to that place is a complex confluence of inequality, racial inequality, income inequality. I think it's also related to lack of investment in affordability, affordable housing in this country over the past 30 years, particularly in the state of California and the United States. So that lack of investment you see up and down the state of California when you don't invest in affordable housing and when you don't invest in communities, neighborhoods. This is the result. So I think the one thing that I know for sure ends homelessness is a house. And I think that folks are better able to deal with the complexities of behavioral health issues, or in their efforts to recover from substance use. They're able to address those issues or to get a job. I mean, let's not ignore the fact around employment, also health inequalities really have an impact on people's finances and their ability to stabilize. So it's a combination of many of those things, yet certainly there's across the table, the issue is about affordability and housing and lack of investment and inequality across the country, and particularly in California.
And Shari, St. Vincent de Paul lived 400 years ago, and he was dealing with these issues.
Yeah, I
of,
hope.
of people living in poverty, people who were ill, people who were on the margins of society. There's a lot that hasn't changed, and we're still dealing with it, aren't we?
Yes, I mean, St. Vincent de Paul in San Francisco has been in existence since 1833. So you can tell that it's a very old nonprofit, making sure we take care of the most vulnerable in our society. So we've been through a lot of major disasters that have happened in San Francisco, through the earthquake and several things like that, the fire. So we've been taking care of those who are in need for those many years. So it's a lot. And so now we're in, and we don't necessarily do thrift stores. A lot of people think St. Vincent de Paul is about thrift stores. So we are doing services, social services, shelters. We have a large shelter and a navigation center. We also provide services for survivors of domestic violence.
So we're sitting here at the cusp of an election where poverty has been accentuated by the pandemic because it has not fallen on people equally. We have a even greater consciousness of the 4 centuries of racism in this country and our reckoning here. We have disinvestment at the lower ends and tax breaks at the higher ends, which have been, and we've got huge deficits. How do we move forward and try to heal some of these issues? Because, you know, there's only so much inequality that any society can take before people just get fed up and we collapse into violence and disorder. Shari, how do you see us trying to create a consensus for support to solve these issues, where that will inevitably mean that people who have more will have to give more, whether it's through taxes or through contributions, in order to try and heal these disparities and bring American society together? How do you see this?
Well, what Beth and John spoke about earlier, I mean, there needs to be a shift. So right now there's housing in San Francisco, but it's not necessarily affordable housing. It's not the right type of housing. So we need to shift how we look at building communities. So if we're looking at people or families who can afford housing and minimum wage is $11 or $15, what does that mean for a family if your housing is $800,000 or $1 million up? So we have to shift and make sure that we have an equitable housing income level, as well as businesses that can support everyone. The ultra rich, so there's nothing wrong. We live in a capitalist society. There's nothing wrong with making money, but at the same time, those who are making money need to think about who's in their neighborhood, who's in their community. And that means shifting that mindset that housing is just not for the rich, but it's for everyone. Everyone deserves a place to call home.
Doesn't it also speak to the identity of a city? Because if you have these world cities that become places that only can house the wealthy, you create monocultures and you create a separation from the history of a place. Beth, when we take a look at the bell curve of wealth, right? At one end, we have the very wealthy, and the other end, we have the very poor. And then the middle part is kind of what we've always designated as the middle class. Are you seeing an erosion of the capability of people at the lower ends to just be able to afford the day-to-day expenses, as John pointed out? And how do we address that? Because we can't suddenly create factory jobs in the middle of an urban center like New York, or in the middle of a place like Chicago, right? How do we deal with that disparity?
I mean, I think that all of us, I know that Shari and I are both represented by unions in our organizations, and work in a city that has made an effort to increase the minimum compensation for workers in San Francisco. We're not there yet. It's certainly an effort, but each year we have to commit to that as a community, and in our negotiations, with our union representatives. I really think that a livable wage is necessary in San Francisco. It's something that we, I think, need to stop aspiring to and need to commit to. I think it's an issue of priorities, right? So what are we prioritizing as a society? What are we investing in? Are we investing in communities, particularly Black and Brown communities? Are we investing in our essential workers who are putting their lives and their families' lives on the line each day in terms of being there, particularly for those that have lived experience of homelessness or who are experiencing homelessness and working, in our communities and working for our organization, Shari's organization, John's organization. And I just think that, that type of disparity really requires bold solutions, and it requires leadership. I know some communities are looking at universal cash transfers and ways to help really commit to bringing people up to a wage or an income, let's call it an income, where they're able to survive, and not just survive, but live, and have stability so that they can engage in some type of employment training or go to work, be able to afford childcare. I mean, affordable childcare is essential, particularly for single moms who represent a large percentage of those folks that are unhoused, particularly Black and Brown women who are single moms, right?
You're pointing out something that's really important. I'm sorry for interrupting, but I want to draw attention to this idea of the working poor,
Right.
of being stacked. And I see Shari and John, you're nodding.
Yes.
This idea of the working poor, previously homelessness, if you had a mental health issue, one can understand it was difficult to hold a job and to gain an income. If you were in real impoverished circumstances where you didn't have any job skills, okay, one can understand it. But now it looks like we're stacking layer upon layer of working poor, people who are on the front lines in restaurants or responders or teachers. John, are you seeing the same kind of stacking up in which we have people who are working their butts off, holding two jobs, but they're just not able to get the housing that they need?
Yeah.
Yes, there's two primary drivers that we see. So one is in our capitalist society, the whole concept of supply and demand. I spoke earlier about the shortage of housing.
Right.
So our housing costs in the Bay Area have gone up 88% since around 2010, so over the last 10 years.
Mhm.
And our increase in average household income has only gone up 17%. So you have that.
Could you repeat that statistic, the juxtaposition there? Just
certainly. So housing costs have gone up 88%, while income has only gone up 17%. So if you look at the graph, right, it's this gap that's been one of the biggest issues. And you add that in, it's the supply and demand piece to it. It makes it very, very difficult. The other factor is the minimum wage isn't enough. In Contra Costa County, where I am right now, it takes 4.5 minimum wage jobs to afford an average 2-bedroom apartment.
4.5 minimum wage jobs.
4.5. And I was born in San Francisco. I went to school there. I've worked there. And it's out of reach for really most people today. And it's spreading through the East Bay and beyond. So I think, what we need to tackle is not only the lack of housing, but also find a way to get the minimum wage much, much higher than it's been proposed both locally in, some of the cities and counties, as well as at the state level.
And then you have the issue of disparity, in which the lower paid jobs are very often assigned to women versus men, right? You have the disparity of race, which is endemic, of education. And so what you end up having happen is a combination, a confluence of factors end up creating this caste system, really, Shari, right? I mean, we have a caste system in the United States, and you see this generation upon generation upon generation. Now, if we're helping to house people on a temporary basis, we're providing shelter on an emergency basis, how do we lift people out of poverty on a sustained basis in order to change the calculus? And is there a role for some sort of legislative or legal framework, regulatory framework that also has a consensus agreement, so that we don't end up having these incredible political fights that just create more heat than light? How do we deal with that from a St. Vincent de Paul perspective?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily on St. Vincent de Paul or even nonprofits. I think you said, it's a political thing. So it's an investment in the city from the supervisors and the mayor. And I think the mayor has done a good job, along with some supervisors, of making sure there's some reinvestment into the African-American community in San Francisco. At one point, the population of African-Americans in San Francisco was at 13%, maybe in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. Now it's currently around 4 to 6%, but 37% of the homeless are African-American. So there's a big, huge need for reinvestment at the educational level, housing level, supporting so that there's home ownership. Otherwise, you're going to lose the entire African-American population, because there is no way for them to catch up to where there's some good jobs with when the ports were open, the shipyards. That's when a lot of the economic boom for the African-American community was there. And now those jobs are no longer there. They have shifted to the tech jobs, stuff that people can do and work from home. So we need to reinvest in that kind of job training, workforce development, and support with housing.
So could you make the case, if I'm a tech executive or I'm in financial services, why do I care to have my taxes increase? Why do I care to contribute philanthropically to somebody who is not of my race? Why do I care, Shari?
Why do you care? I think any community needs to be diverse. It's a richer community. I mean, this is what America was built upon, is, equality for all. And so how do you live in a monolithic type of environment and think that you can contribute to the community, that you're a citizen of the world? I know that a lot of people who have traveled and seen different parts of the world, they have a different mindset of those who stay in their own community and know only about their own world and their own family. I think in order for us to be continuing to be a strong nation, a strong neighborhood, we need to have diversity and equality and equity and inclusion. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have these major divides that are breaking the country right now.
And Beth, how do you make that? I'm sorry, go ahead, Beth.
Yeah, I just want to say that it would be my hope that any CEO who's an executive of a for-profit corporation would have diversity within their corporation, right? In their business. That's the hope, the diversity of race, the diversity of the LGBTQ community, the diversity of a variety of individuals. And that, I think that for corporations, the investment has to be in community. It can't be, I think there was so much frustration around, tax breaks and things like that. And it's complex and it is a discussion, yet at the same time, large corporations in the Bay Area, because of the delta between wealth, because of the lack of investment in housing, really have to contribute into the community, into the, not just their workers, but in the communities in which they live. And it can't be, it can no longer be a situation where their presence is taking away from a community or impacting a community in terms of housing and prices. There has to be, I think, a absolutely deliberate effort to be looking at that, to ensure that company is invested in looking at that and not doing damage to a community, not, escalating, rent prices and decreasing affordability. There's a responsibility to that, to be in that community from my perspective. And I think there's a lot more work. There's a lot of work being done, but I think there's a lot more work to be done by corporations across the country, but particularly in the Bay Area around the divide. And the impact that they're having on communities. There has to be an acknowledgement of that damage.
I think there's also a very selfish argument to be made. If I'm a tech executive and I don't really live amongst people of diverse incomes, of diverse races, ethnicities, sensibilities, my customers are those people. They are buying my software, my hardware, my devices. If I am a banker, my customers, the people who are actually supporting my lifestyle, are people who don't necessarily look like me or live like me, right? The more customers I have, the more we allow people to fall into poverty, the fewer customers I have, the less thriving my business becomes.
Right.
So, and so if not for the sake of values and a question of diversity, even just self-interest would seem to indicate that that's where we should go. We did 2 polls. One, we asked whether this problem was solvable. 88% of people said that it was, and 12% of people felt that homelessness is not solvable. Let's talk about the solutions that you each see, and start off with John. John, if you were going to select one great solution, and I know that there are a number of different programs that you offer, John, so I'm just going to restrict you to one because I want to give Shari and Beth a bite at this apple as well. But if you were to select one thing, what is the thing that you would look at?
I can't choose just one. I'm sorry. So, but I'll be quick. So at Shelter Inc., we're actually going to have our 34th anniversary on November 17th. So we've been around a long time. We actually operate in 3 counties now, Contra Costa, Solano, and Sacramento. So it goes back to something Beth said earlier. There's a wide spread of needs for people who are homeless. And it's really, you have to treat each individual and let them go down their own path. There isn't one single solution. So in our world, we have 5 shelters across the 3 counties. We have hundreds of units of permanent supportive housing, as well as rapid rehousing. So the difference is permanent supportive housing is people that have mental or physical disabilities, and they get subsidies. In rapid rehousing, we provide a subsidy for a limited period of time going forward. And more important to today where we are is our prevention program. So we've been fortunate in a couple of the counties where we've received a fair amount of money from both foundations as well as city and county governments to be able to provide those families who have been severely financially impacted by the pandemic to help them maintain their housing over time. So I really think there needs to be a variety of solutions out there because everybody starts, from their own unique place.
So your point is to meet people where they are first,
Exactly.
and each individual. Shari, how do you see it?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, so there's different reasons why people are homeless. I mean, we even have in our shelters, we even have people that are working that are homeless because they can't afford a place of their own. And I think one of the things we're known for is making sure that we treat our homeless, we call them guests as opposed to clients or homeless. Those who are unhoused are our guests. And we make sure we treat everyone with dignity and respect so that they still have that ability to do what they need to do. And so we're working on problem solving with all our guests. You know, what do you need? What are you missing? How do we help you? How do we refer you to an organization, to income, whatever you need? So I think that you have to treat everyone based on that one-on-one connection to decide on what they need to do to end their homelessness.
And Beth, I take it that you also believe that we have to look at the individual, but let's also talk about organizing, because you also have to create programs that cross individuals. So as you create programs, where do you emphasize the first line of defense?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, that's a great question. I think that I will go back to the other question for a moment. And in terms of, on the macro scale, I do think that a piece of it that often gets left out of these conversations is displacement in communities, particularly in poor communities or communities that are not invested in. And so I think that we have to really look at displacement, and we have to look at prevention. We have to really pay attention to folks falling into homelessness. We're often in reaction mode in terms of line of defense, to get to your question. Whereas I think there has to be a lot of work done to ensure that folks that are older, who, should not be, falling into homelessness. The idea of, oh, we're gonna, work with someone who's 75 and be able to get them into job training program and other tools in the toolkit that folks utilize to try and stabilize someone's income and get them into housing and stabilize in housing. That's not the solution. And so I think that there's a multitude of things we have to look at as a community, as a society. And I think we have to really stop folks from being displaced, to Shari's point, from their community. We have to prevent people from falling into homelessness in the first place. So we're not always in reaction mode, that we're getting ahead of it. We have to go upstream and look at the systems, the folks that are impacted by systems the most, systems like the criminal justice system. And when you ask me about what is that front line of defense, for me, it's really kind of looking at housing and housing affordability. And I go back to that, and I will continue to go back to that, because I think that for many folks, particularly when you look at folks coming out of the criminal justice system who walk outside of the door and into homelessness, it's inexcusable, right? Folks need to walk out of the door and into a home, right? To give them an opportunity to stabilize their lives. And I think that that's what we can and should be focused on. One, in trying our very best to ensure people do not become homeless in the first place. And then on the other side of that, really ensuring that we have a healthy supply of affordable housing and supportive housing, making that distinction that John made, that this is about, for folks that are chronically homeless, that have very complex issues, that we have deeply affordable, supportive housing they have a lease in their name, and they have services on site so that they can stabilize and not be on the street, for decades, because we see that.
There is a fallacy that although it is a fallacy, it's a valid concern, that we create sustainable codependence. The fallacy is that nobody wants to be sustainably codependent. People want to figure out a way to be independent. We asked in a poll, what are the most important things we can do to reduce homelessness? And the results are really interesting. The highest responses were to increase early intervention programs, provide more supportive services, which is a flavor of that, integrate affordable housing into all kinds of neighborhoods so that it's spread out in regions as opposed to clustered, and provide more temporary shelters so to get on your feet. So it's a combination of affordability and quick interventions to prevent people from falling into homelessness. The least votes were received by sort of the punitive approach. And then we also took a poll as to who's responsible for this. And that was also very interesting. Individuals got 6%, businesses 3%, nonprofits got 12%. 72% felt that government has a role. So let's talk a little bit about this as we close. And we'll take the reverse order, and we'll talk. We'll start with Shari, and then Beth, and then John Eckstrom. As you look at government and government's role, do you believe that government has the primary role? And how do we deal with the fact that every time government gets involved, we end up with these massive societal arguments in which we have, people dividing into camps and saying no government, bad government, or whatever? How do we now take an approach that incorporates these various concerns and ends up with more light than heat generated, Shari?
Well, for me, the government is the people in the neighborhood. So yes, I mean, we have government contracts, and that's what sustains us and helps us provide services. But also, what's the priority that the people from the government say? Do we want shelters in our neighborhoods? Do we want homeless on the street? So somebody has to take that mantle and say, we have to get people off the street. What's the priority? So that's where your supervisors, your mayors, your councilmen, your governors come in to say, yes, we have this problem, and it needs to be solved. And in partnership with nonprofits or other businesses and community leaders, we're taking care of our community. So the government, we pay our taxes, and that's where our tax dollars go, to making sure that our communities are balanced. So I think everyone has a part. So the government is the larger part, but at the same time, we also have community leaders and nonprofits. So it's a shared responsibility.
So I love this answer. So there are people who really need help. The people who have mental health challenges, and we've just received a number of questions focused on how do we address that. And what you're saying is that that's really a communal responsibility. In our families, if we have a family member who needs that type of help, the family gathers together and figures it out. And we are the family for those people in America who have those kinds of challenges. I think it's a wonderful point. Beth, what is your view of how government should function? And is it really reserved for those people who have those kinds of issues? Or is there also a framework that government should set up that allows other actors to coordinate and collaborate effectively?
Yeah, I think that the broader question, does government have a responsibility? Absolutely, without question. I think that government does have a responsibility in terms of providing the safety net for people not to fall through and be on the street. I think that there is a responsibility there. I think government, participates in taxing its citizens and has a responsibility to invest in communities and invest in housing. The revenue that comes into communities, it's nothing that an individual would be able to provide, or for the most part, even a corporation or a foundation for that matter. And so, but we need everyone to participate in the solution. And to Shari's point, there are, efforts in communities where they are bringing public and private partnerships to the table. One recently I was in or aware of and involved in was with the state leveraging, 15 million of their own funds and 15 million of, philanthropy funds from foundations to really work on the issue of addressing the COVID outbreak in the prison population and exits into housing. And so the type of efforts like Tipping Point and the San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund, and how we all partner together to really kind of leverage resources, because I think that that's essential. I think it's essential that a community member participate in elections and participate in becoming an elected official so that they have a voice and can represent their constituents and community. We're all part of the solution, but it takes a political will. It takes bold, I think, decisions at this time and bold leadership if we're going to really kind of close the divide and end homelessness, which I absolutely believe is possible and agree with the poll. So I think that it's all of us. It's not one person, but it does take an entire community. It takes a system of care working together. And I think in government, that's often hard to do. So that's the, you know, some of the work that's in front of us. And it takes a regional approach. Let me just say this too, that I do think that we have to work more regionally in California and in other states to really address the issue of homelessness.
So we're coming to the end of our time. John, I'm going to give you the last word. We hear a lot about income redistribution. And the question that I have is that we take money from citizens and employ it for the common defense of the nation. Is part of what we need to do to strengthen America to deal with poverty so that we take capability that is on the sidelines that can't actually be productively invested in strengthening the country and create a circumstance where people can work, can live, can contribute, and thereby make America stronger, which would justify my taxes being spent for that. Is that really part of it? Are we defending the nation and strengthening the nation through these types of programs?
I believe we are. Beth mentioned, you know, the safety net, and I'd like to talk about that just for a second. So when Ronald Reagan, I'm old enough to remember listening to him on the TV when, we won't talk about my age, shutting down the mental health hospitals, he said, well, families and churches will take care of them. So back in the 1800s, that was a true statement. People lived in small towns. The center of the town was the church. Everybody went, multiple generations of families lived there.
Everybody knew each other?
Yeah, you had that ingrained safety net. You know, I have family all over the world, right? Church is much less visited these days compared to what it was, you know, 100, 200 years ago. So that's my comments on that. Back to the income inequality piece. We've seen this with the disappearing middle class over the last 20, 30 years, right? Or as John Maynard Keynes said, you know, last century, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And his prediction from the early 20th century is happening. And that's what we're seeing. So how we redistribute that wealth, you know, the government typically does it through tax programs. And Beth is correct in saying that this is a regional issue. I'll call your attention. I don't know if you can see this, but this was a Bay Area Council report that McKinsey did. And their number one finding was this is a regional issue. And what we see is our funding for our nonprofits are very siloed. So you get dollars for one specific thing. And what us as nonprofits have to do is pull those funds together and braid them to create an effective program, right? So, and that's, I think, part of the difficulty. Shari mentioned, you know, the system of care that we have. We have people in crisis with oftentimes not all the abilities in order to be able to navigate a very complex system of care. So part of our approach is, and our mission is self-sufficiency. So we provide as many wraparound services as we can, either through our own programs and staff or by collaborating with lots of other agencies, because it takes all those resources to help people get onto that path of self-sufficiency.
I think another term for income redistribution is investment in solving certain problems. We're a problem-solving nation. We've always been strongest when we've had two things going for us. One is engaging our diverse communities in problem solving, whether it's on the business side, on the social civic society side, on the government side. When we are focused on problem solving instead of arguing about things, we are strong. And the other piece is that when we have a strong middle class, we see middle class under threat. We see us arguing instead of solving. Let's adjust ourselves. Let's do what we can for ourselves and with our friends, come together and change America in the way that we would envision the country being stronger. I'd like to thank you all for being with us. That's the nonprofit report for today. Also want to remind people that on the November 3rd, election day, please vote, and we will have an open mic conversation for anyone who votes to express their opinions on this show at this time. And on the 12th, we're going to have a discussion about media and nonprofits. How do we use media footprints to create visibility and engagement for nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders? Thank you so much, John Eckstrom, the CEO of Shelter Incorporated, Beth Stokes, Executive Director of Episcopal Community Services, and Shari, Wooldridge, the Executive Director of St. Vincent de Paul Society. Thank you so much for your work. Attendees, thank you for coming, and stay safe, mask up.